What is AAVE? How's it different from a Blaccent or from Ebonics? There's a lot of talk out there about how African Americans speak and a lot of confusion. Even most of the well-intentioned explainers are from people who don't speak it, haven't studied it in depth, or both. By the way, yes, I grew up in AAE speech communities, and yes, I have a PhD in sociolinguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, where I wrote my dissertation on regional accents in African American English. But obviously, I know there are limitations to my knowledge. So I sat down with 4 Black scholars who publish on AAE here. And if you haven't watched it, you should check it out. Today, we're going to take a quick look at what African American English is and isn't, its history, its features, and everything you need to know, hopefully without retreading too much ground that's already been covered by other people. But first, don't forget to like and subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones, and this is Language Jones. What is AAVE? AAVE is an acronym for African American Vernacular English. Other terms for it in academia are African American varieties of English, African American English, and Black English Vernacular. Note, since I wrote the original blog post about this in 2014, a new term gained a lot of traction with academics, African American language, as in the Oxford Handbook of African American Language, edited by Sandra Lanehart, or the Corpus of Regional African American Language, CORAL. I now use either AAE or AAL exclusively unless I'm specifically talking about an informal vernacular variety. However, AAVE has gained traction in social media just as AAL replaced it among academics. In popular culture, it's largely misunderstood and thought of as bad English, Ebonics, originally coined in 1973 by someone with good intentions from Ebony and Phonics, but now starting to become a slur, Ghetto Talk, definitely a slur, and Blaccent, a portmanteau of black and accent that NPR seems to like using. Sometimes it's also just thought of as slang and nothing else. Why do I say it's misunderstood? Because it's emphatically not bad English. It's a full-fledged dialect of English, just like, say, British English or Australian English. It's entirely rule-bound, meaning it has a very clear grammar which can be, and has been, described in great detail. There are entire books on it, like African American English, Structure, History, and Use, African American English, A Linguistic Introduction, and the Oxford Handbook of African American Language. By the way, you can buy these from the links below in the description. Anyway, it's not simply ungrammatical. If you don't conform to the grammar of AAE, the result is ungrammatical sentences in AAE. All that said, its grammar is different than many other dialects of English. In fact, it can do some really cool things that other varieties of English can't. So here's a quick rundown of what it is and what it do. First, where does it come from? AAE was born in the American South and shares many features with Southern American English. However, it was born out of the horrifically ugly history of chattel slavery in the United States. Black Americans, by and large, did not voluntarily move to North America with like-minded people of shared language and cultural background, as happened with waves of British, Irish, Italian, German, Swedish, Dutch, and other immigrants. Rather, people from different cultures and language cultures were torn from their homelands and sold into chattel slavery. Enslaved people in the U.S. were systematically segregated from speakers of their own languages, lest they band together with other speakers of, say, Wolof, a West African language, and violently seize freedom. There are 2 main competing hypotheses about the linguistic origins of AAE, neither of which will linguists ever be likely to fully prove because the history of the U.S. has completely obscured the origins of the dialect. Because of historical racism, we're left with hypotheses instead of documentation. The 2 hypotheses are the Creole origin hypothesis and the dialect divergence hypothesis. Both are politically charged. Linguists are people too. The first is that contact between English speakers and among speakers of other languages led to the formation of a Creole language with an English superstrate but strong Pan-African grammatical influences, meaning lots and lots of English words but still a distinct language from English. Another example of such a language is Bislama. The second hypothesis is that it's basically a sister dialect of Southern American English, which started to diverge in the 1700s and 1800s. How's it different? AAE has a number of really cool grammatical features that non-speakers tend to mistake for bad grammar or lazy grammar. Here's a by no means exhaustive list of the key differences between it and the useful hypothetical construct General American, basically classroom English or how newscasters speak. 1. Deletion of verbal copula. Not as dirty as it sounds. This means that in some contexts, the word is or are can be left out. If you think this is lazy grammar, speakers of Russian, Arabic, Mandarin, and a whole bunch of other languages would like to have a word with you. An example would be, he working. In classroom English, that's he is working. 2. A habitual aspect marker, known as habitual be or invariant be. Aspect refers to whether an action is completed or ongoing. Habitual aspect means that a person regularly or often or usually does a thing, but doesn't give any indication of whether they're currently in the process of doing that thing. An example would be, he be working, meaning he's usually working. 3. A remote perfect marker, stressed been. This communicates that not only is something the case, and not only is it completed, that is perfective aspect, but it has been for a long time. An example, he been got a job, meaning he got a job a long time ago and still has it. You could also say he been working to mean he's been working for a long time. 4. Negative concord. This means that all negation has to match. If you've ever studied French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Russian, or any of a whole slew of other languages, you've seen this. It's often stigmatized in English. Don't use double negatives. But it's totally normal in many, many languages and many varieties of English. Example, he ain't never without a job. Can't nobody say he don't work. For more on one flavor of this, check out this video I made with Christopher Hall for the Linguistic Society of America 2022 annual meeting on cutting-edge research on this topic here, or the nerdier conference talk version of it here. 5. It for the dummy expletive there. What's a dummy expletive? It's a word that's necessary to say things when there isn't really an agent doing the thing in question, like it's raining. Some languages can just say raining and be done with it. English is not one of them. In contexts where speakers of other dialects might say there, some AAE speakers say it. Example, is a man at the door here to see you? More famous example.
I said, oh Lord Jesus, it's a fire.
It be days, it be good, but mostly money be slow.
6. Preterite had. This refers to grammatical constructions that in other dialects don't use had, but use the simple past. It's usually used in narrative. An example is, he had went to work and then he had called his client, meaning he went to work and then he called his client. 7. Some varieties have semantic bleaching of words that are considered obscenities in other dialects. This is where a word loses a shade of meaning over time. There are quite a few other cool grammatical features and quirks, but these are among the major innovations. Yes, innovations. This is just scraping the surface. Entire books and entire dissertations have been written about this. There's also a lot of lexical variation in plain English different words. Sounds cool, you say. What's the big deal, you ask? Basically, racism. Yeah, I said it. And linguistic prejudice. We have a long history of assuming that whatever black people in America do is defective. Couple this with what seems to be a natural predilection towards thinking that however other people talk is wrong, and you've got a recipe for social and linguistic stigma. For instance, in 1996, the Oakland School Board took the sensible step of trying to use AAE as a bridge to teach AAE-speaking children how to speak and write standard American English, or classroom English. They also took the less sensible step of declaring AAE a completely different language. This was wildly misrepresented in the media, leading to a storm of racist, self-congratulatory ain't a word pedantry from white people and older middle-class black people who don't speak the dialect, whether out of an inability or their own prejudice against it. As an aside, ain't been a word for over 300 years. The use of Ebonics as a derisive slur comes out of this national media storm. Literally, nobody even wanted to teach AAE. They simply wanted to use the native dialect of pre-literate children as a bridge to teach the standard classroom dialect and to teach reading and writing. Like this program, Academic English Mastery in Watts. How awesome is that? Instead, it was portrayed as a Marxist nutjob trying to force anarchist anti-grammar on helpless, white American children instead of teaching them standard English. There's absolutely nothing wrong with AAE, but it is stigmatized for social and historical reasons related to race, socioeconomic class, and prestige. Honestly, I wish more people actually taught it, even if just as a college elective. Some of our societal ills could be addressed with, more knowledge and not less. So who speaks it? In general, black Americans. However, there's exceptions to every part of this. Not all black Americans speak it. For instance, Bill Cosby, who displays his ignorance of dialect variation often and with gusto. Some black non-Americans speak it. For instance, Drake, who speaks it professionally and is Canadian. Not all people who speak it are black. For instance, Eminem and that white guy in the movie Barbershop. I even know a white linguist from the Netherlands who speaks fluent AAE as a second language. It's a language like any other, after all, although that kind of speaker is super rare. In general, it can be assumed that non-black Americans probably don't speak or understand it. It's a safe bet. You can't necessarily assume, however, that a given black American does speak it. I recently tried to do the math to get a rough idea of how many people speak it and came up with something like 30 million people, plus or minus about 10. I did this by looking at census data, linguistics papers that make estimates about how many black people do speak it, for instance, Rickford 1999, and guesses about how many non-black AAE speakers might exist. So basically, I pulled it out of a hat. Note to self, this would make a good research project. Note to other academics, I called it. Many people who do speak it are extremely adept at code switching. In the popular imagination, that's deftly switching between dialects or registers as the social situation calls for. As an aside, one common trope used by those against its recognition as a dialect is, no academic could ever teach a class or publish in it. The argument being that linguists are hypocritical for claiming it's a legitimate dialect since they could never actually publish in it. This would be simply misguided if it weren't for the fact that linguists like Geneva Smitherman have actually published articles in AAE. Is it spoken the same everywhere? Yes and no. Certain grammatical features seem to be universally used in AAE, however, there's regional variation in pronunciation. Leave me a comment if you want me to say more on this in another video. One key finding in sociolinguistics that was hard for me to wrap my head around at first is that a given dialect, Appalachian English, Philadelphia English, Yiddish English, African American English, may have 20 different distinctive features, but individual speakers might not use all 20. So someone who never uses habitual B can still be a native speaker of AAE. My dissertation research demonstrated that there are at least 10 distinctive accents in AAE. Other research shows that there may be regional variation in what syntactic structures are used in AAE. For instance, be done constructions, as in I be done went home and they be getting wild, used to be common in Philadelphia. We know this because we have recordings. But now, some young people report having never heard such sentences, or that they're the kind of thing that their grandparents might say, but not them. Linguists don't all agree on what the core features are, although things like habitual B, stressed bin, consonant cluster simplification, and syllable codas are all good candidates. Features that only exist in AAE but aren't universal in AAE are relevant too, like replacing the D in words like bleeding with a glottal stop, that is, bleatin'. There's also different registers in AAE, so Arthur Spears, for instance, argues that African American Standard English has different features from AAVE. Both are under the umbrella of AAE. An example might be the pronunciation of T in words like indemnity, where most white speakers of American English would pronounce that T as an alveolar tap, that is, indemnity, but many African American English speakers who are speaking formally might produce an aspirated T instead, that is, indemnity. This is the topic of Jesse Grieser's dissertation. There are tons of other factors that affect whether someone speaks AAVE or AASE in a given circumstance. Closing thoughts. AAVE is a dialect of English like any other, but suffers extreme stigma due to the history of race in America. It has a systematic, coherent, rule-bound grammar. It's got some super cool grammatical features that allow it to communicate complex ideas in fewer words than other dialects of English. While the rise of hip-hop and some reintegration of our cities has exposed more of the mainstream to some varieties of AAE, it's still unfortunately highly stigmatized. Regarding those who still think it's somehow not valid, I think Oscar Gamble said it best. They don't think it be like it is, but it do. So what do you think? What's the most interesting grammatical feature of AAE? What did I leave out? What do you want to know more about? Leave me a comment below. If you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe. Until next time.